Look closer at this painting. I mean, really look. It's one of the most famous, most analyzed, and most mysterious works of art in all of Western history. It is Las Meninas, the Ladies-in-Waiting, painted by the Grand Master Diego Velázquez in 1656. Right at its very center, bathed in an almost divine light, a little girl stands frozen in time. She is just 5 years old, a vision in shimmering silver and rose pink, with blonde hair that fans out around her head like a wispy halo. Her name is Margarita Teresa, Infanta of Spain. And she gazes out from this 350-year-old canvas with a serene, almost unnerving confidence that seems impossible for her age. Here in this vast, shadowy room of the Royal Alcazar Palace in Madrid, she is the undeniable heart of the scene, the gravitational center of a complex world of courtiers, dwarves, ladies-in-waiting, and even the artist himself, who stands grimly at his easel. Look to the back wall, and you'll see her parents, the king and queen, reflected like ghosts in a mirror. To anyone in the 17th century, this painting was more than art. It was a revolutionary statement of power. It was propaganda, meant to depict a stable, divinely ordained dynasty with a bright young heir poised to secure its glorious future. But this is not a portrait of a happy family. It is a beautiful, magnificent lie. This is the face of a princess, immortalized in a single moment of gilded tranquility. But behind those innocent eyes lies a secret so horrifying it feels like it belongs in a Gothic novel. She was born for one reason and one reason only, to be the bride of her own uncle. This is the tragic story of Margarita Teresa, a victim of royal incest, whose entire life was a sacrifice to a dying, desperate dynasty. Her fairy tale was a nightmare, and the curse that ran hot and thick through her veins would not only seal her fate, but would bring an entire global empire crashing to its knees. She was never just a child, she was a political pawn. She wasn't a princess destined for greatness, but a lamb bred for the slaughter. Margarita Teresa was born on July 12, 1651, into a world of suffocating opulence and crushingly rigid protocol. She was the first daughter of King Philip IV of Spain and his second wife, Mary Anne of Austria. But this was no simple royal match. Mary Anne wasn't just Philip's wife, she was his niece. He was 30 years her senior. Their union was the epitome of the Habsburg dynasty's guiding principle, a ruthless, obsessive, and ultimately self-destructive policy of inbreeding. For centuries, the Habsburgs, rulers of vast territories across Europe from Spain to the Holy Roman Empire, had practiced a strategy of dynastic consolidation. They didn't conquer new lands with armies so much as they absorbed them through marriage contracts. Their family motto said it all: Bella gerent ali, to Felix Austrian noob, let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry? To keep their immense power and staggering wealth from being diluted or lost to other royal houses, they twisted their family tree into a tangled, suffocating knot. They married cousins to cousins, and in the most extreme, desperate cases, uncles to nieces. From the very moment of her birth, Margarita Teresa was a critical piece in this terrifying game. The birth itself was harrowing, nearly killing her young mother. But the baby's survival was paramount. Her aging father, King Philip IV, called her mi alegria, my joy. Yet this paternal affection was completely inseparable from her dynastic value. At the time Velázquez painted Las Meninas, Margarita was the dynasty's great hope. Her older half-sister, Maria Teresa, was alive, but her claim to the throne was complicated, as she was destined to marry the King of France, Spain's greatest rival. Any sons she had would be Bourbons, not Habsburgs. Meanwhile, Margarita's younger siblings had all perished in infancy. The future of the Spanish Empire, the largest and most powerful empire on the face of the earth, rested squarely on the fragile shoulders of this one little girl. Her childhood was lived entirely in the public eye, yet it must have been profoundly, achingly lonely. She was raised under the strict, somber etiquette of the Spanish court, a world of ritual and performance where every gesture was codified and every word was weighed. She was surrounded by an army of servants, tutors, and ladies-in-waiting, the very Meninas of the famous painting, but genuine, unconditional affection was a commodity rarer than gold. Her health, her growth, her appearance, all of it was treated as a matter of state security, meticulously documented and reported to foreign courts. This was because her destiny had been sealed long before she could even speak its name. From her earliest years, she was formally betrothed to another Habsburg, her maternal uncle and paternal first cousin, Leopold I, the Holy Roman Emperor in Vienna. Diego Velázquez, the court painter, became her official biographer in oil and canvas. He captured her evolution in a series of extraordinary, haunting portraits. These weren't just family keepsakes. They were diplomatic updates sent to Vienna, progress reports for her future husband, her uncle. We see her at age 2, a cherubic toddler in a heavy pink dress, her eyes wide with a child's curiosity. We see her at 5 in Las Meninas, poised and commanding, the center of her own universe. We see her again at age 8, this time in a somber, restrictive blue gown, her expression now heavier, the weight of her future perhaps beginning to settle upon her. In each painting, Velázquez captures a fragile, haunting beauty, but it is the beauty of a doll, perfectly dressed, perfectly posed, perfectly silent. These portraits are the visual record of a child being groomed for a single, solemn purpose, to be a womb for the House of Habsburg, to produce a male heir who would unite the Spanish and Austrian branches of the family and secure their dominance for another generation. The gilded cage of the Madrid Alcazar was beautiful, but it was a cage nonetheless, and the door was already locked and barred. To truly understand the tragedy of Margarita Teresa's life, you first have to stare into the genetic abyss that the Habsburg dynasty had willfully, arrogantly plunged itself into. Their strategy of marrying within the family was, for a time, fantastically successful. It created a colossal, pan-European political entity unlike anything seen before. But the biological price they paid was catastrophic. Generations of these consanguineous marriages between close relatives had turned their precious gene pool into a stagnant, toxic pond of recessive, and often horrifyingly deleterious traits. Let's try to put this into perspective. A typical person has 32 distinct ancestors in their 5th generation back, 32 different lines converging into them. Because of the relentless intermarrying of her forebears, Margarita Teresa had only 10. Her parents weren't just king and queen, they were uncle and niece. Her inbreeding coefficient, a scientific measure of genetic similarity, was calculated by some researchers to be 0.254. That's a staggering figure, so high that it is genetically equivalent to the offspring of a brother-sister pairing. The family tree wasn't a branching tree at all. It was a tightly woven wreath, circling back on itself again and again and again. The most infamous physical result of this genetic decay was the Habsburg jaw. Known medically as mandibular prognathism, this condition resulted in a severely jutting lower jaw and a prominent, fleshy lower lip that often drooped open. It frequently made chewing and even speaking clearly incredibly difficult. Many Habsburgs also suffered from the opposite problem in their upper jaw, which was underdeveloped. The combination created a distinctive and often disfiguring facial structure that became the dynasty's unavoidable signature. Looking at portraits of Habsburg rulers through the 16th and 17th centuries is like watching a slow-motion disaster unfold, as this genetic calling card becomes more and more pronounced with each doomed generation. But the problems ran far deeper than just their faces. The Habsburgs were plagued by a host of devastating health issues. Infant and child mortality rates were heartbreakingly high. Even within the gilded cage of the royal court, with access to the very best medical care of the age, some estimates suggest that as many as half of all Habsburg children died before reaching the age of 10. This was a direct result of something called inbreeding depression, where harmful recessive genes, which would normally be masked by healthy dominant genes from an unrelated partner, are suddenly expressed because both parents carry the same broken code. They suffered from epilepsy, gout, dropsy, a painful swelling of the tissues, and crippling mental disabilities. The family's obsession with blood purity, or limpieza di sangue, was the cornerstone of their identity. They truly believed their noble blood set them apart, that it was a divine marker of their God-given right to rule. But in a tragic, terrible irony, this pure blood was becoming a poison. They had engineered a system where power was preserved at the direct cost of vitality. Each new generation was a gamble, a roll of the genetic dice that was becoming increasingly loaded against them. They were sacrificing the health and lives of their own children on the altar of dynastic ambition. Margarita Teresa, though appearing relatively healthy in her youth compared to the horrors that were to come, was a product of this toxic legacy. She carried the ticking time bomb of her ancestry deep within her cells. Her life was destined to be a struggle not just against the immense political pressures of her station, but against her own biology. The very blood that made her a princess, an infanta, and a future empress was the same blood that would ultimately and cruelly betray her. The Habsburgs had built their magnificent house on a foundation of incest, and the walls were beginning to crumble. The marriage of Margarita Teresa and Leopold I was never a question of if, but when. It was the absolute linchpin of Habsburg foreign policy. A critical move to create a unified German-Spanish front against the rising power of Bourbon France under the charismatic and ambitious son King Louis XIV. Louis had married Margarita's older half-sister Maria Theresa, and the Habsburgs in both Madrid and Vienna lived in constant, knowing fear that this alliance would be used to assert a French claim on the Spanish throne. Margarita's marriage to Leopold was the ultimate countermove, a powerful statement that the vast Spanish inheritance would remain firmly and forever within Habsburg hands. The negotiations dragged on for years, beginning when she was just a small child. Ambassadors and envoys shuttled endlessly between the Spanish and Austrian courts. The dowry was furiously debated, succession rights were meticulously outlined in excruciating detail, and every facet of the eventual union was scrutinized. King Philip IV was adamant that his daughter's rights to the Spanish throne must be recognized as superior to those of her older sister, just in case his frail male heir, the future Charles II, did not survive. All of this was done without a single word of consultation with Margarita herself. She wasn't a participant, she was the subject of the negotiations, the prize to be won. Finally, in April 1666, the arrangements were complete. After a bizarre proxy marriage in Madrid where an Austrian ambassador stood in for the groom, the 15-year-old Infanta began the long, arduous journey to Vienna to meet her husband and begin her new life. It was a grand procession, a rolling spectacle befitting a future empress, but it was also a funeral march for her childhood and her Spanish identity. She was leaving behind the only home she had ever known, the familiar, solemn rhythms of the Madrid court, and her native tongue. She arrived in Vienna in December 1666, and the official wedding was one of the most magnificent, eye-wateringly expensive spectacles of the entire Baroque era. The festivities lasted for nearly 2 years, a relentless, glittering display of Habsburg power and wealth designed to dazzle and intimidate all of Europe. A brand new 5,000-seat opera house was built just for the occasion. There were elaborate operas, ballets, jaw-dropping fireworks displays, and even a grand equestrian ballet in the courtyard of the Hofburg Palace, where Emperor Leopold himself performed on horseback. It was a spectacle of epic proportions, a thunderous celebration of a union that was meant to secure the future of a continent-spanning dynasty. But behind the deafening public pageantry, the reality was far more somber and deeply unsettling. Margarita Teresa was now married to a man who was not only her elder by 11 years, but was also simultaneously her maternal uncle and her paternal first cousin. The family knot had been pulled tight. In a telling, poignant detail, throughout their marriage, she would never call him by his name or title. She always referred to him as uncle, the German word for uncle. He in turn seemed to be genuinely fond of his child bride, calling her Gretel, an affectionate German diminutive of Margarita. By all contemporary accounts, their personal relationship was surprisingly happy. They bonded over a shared deep Catholic faith and a mutual passion for art and music. Leopold was said to be truly devoted to his young wife. Yet, whatever affection existed between them could not mask the fundamental, isolating truth of her situation. She was a stranger in a strange land. The vibrant theatrical and somewhat raucous culture of the Viennese court was a world away from the rigid, solemn, almost funereal formality of Madrid. She clung fiercely to her Spanish customs, her Spanish entourage, and her Spanish language, reportedly refusing to learn German. This created a cultural and linguistic wall between her and the Austrian nobility, who viewed the young Empress and her Spanish retinue with suspicion, and at times, open hostility. She was the Holy Roman Empress, Queen of the Romans Hungary and Bohemia, but she was also still a child, thrust into a role of immense crushing pressure and expectation. Her primary, and indeed her only purpose in Vienna, was to produce a healthy male heir. The future of the Holy Roman Empire and the very fate of the Spanish succession depended entirely on her fertility. The grand wedding wasn't the end of her sacrifice, it was only the beginning. The weight of two empires now rested upon her shoulders, and the clock was ticking. Life in Vienna very quickly devolved into a brutal, relentless, and soul-crushing cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and grief. Margarita Teresa's body, already burdened by a catastrophically compromised genetic inheritance, was pushed to its absolute limit by the dynastic machine she had been forced to serve. Her personal happiness with Leopold, whatever its genuine depth, was completely overshadowed by the immense physical and emotional toll of her imperial duty. Her life was no longer her own, it belonged to the state, and her womb was its most critical and tormented asset. Between the ages of 16 and 21, a span of just 6 years, Margarita Teresa endured a nightmarish ordeal of constant childbearing. The cycle began almost immediately. In September 1667, less than a year after her spectacular wedding, she gave birth to her first child, a son named Ferdinand Wenzel. The court erupted in celebration. A male heir was born. The future was secured. But the celebration was tragically short-lived. The infant was weak and sickly, and he died just a few months later, in January 1668. The loss was devastating, but in the cold calculus of royal succession, there was no time to mourn. The pressure to produce another heir was immediate and unrelenting. In January 1669, she gave birth again, this time to a daughter, Maria Antonia. A daughter was valuable, but she wasn't the ultimate prize. Little Maria Antonia survived, a small consolation in a court desperate for a male successor. But the grim cycle continued. In 1670, she gave birth to another son, John Leopold, but he survived for only a few agonizing hours. Alongside these live births were several miscarriages, each one a fresh wave of failure, grief, and despair that was felt not just by a mother, but by an entire empire. The constant strain of pregnancy and childbirth absolutely shattered her health. The young, vibrant girl from Velázquez's portraits was gone, replaced by a pale, chronically ill woman who was often bedridden. We now know there is a terrible link between high levels of inbreeding and an increased risk of maternal death shortly after childbirth. Women with a higher inbreeding coefficient were far more likely to suffer fatal complications, suggesting they were simply less physically resilient to the trauma of labor. Margarita was the living embodiment of this statistical danger. She was constantly weak, suffering from debilitating fevers and bone-deep exhaustion. Yet, the demands of the dynasty were pitiless. It's reported that she would often force herself to be up and walking just hours after giving birth, simply to please her husband and demonstrate her readiness to conceive again. This cycle of hope and loss took a profound psychological toll. Her life became a grim rotation through the birthing chamber and the family crypt. She had been sent to Vienna to forge a dynastic link, to bear the son who would guarantee the future. Instead, she was presiding over a series of tiny, heartbreaking coffins. The immense pressure, the very public failures, and the intensely private grief were inescapable. The very purpose of her existence was to give life, but she was surrounded by death. Her body, a vessel for the future of an empire, was failing her. The inbreeding that had defined her lineage was now exacting its cruelest price. The strong social pressure for royal women to produce heirs meant that any loss was met with the immediate expectation to try again, a phenomenon scholars chillingly call reproductive compensation. She was caught in a tragic feedback loop. Her inbred genetics made successful childbirth difficult and dangerous, and the repeated attempts to overcome this biological handicap were in turn systematically destroying her. The imperial womb had become a tomb, and Margarita Teresa was being consumed alive by her sacred duty. As her physical health spiraled downwards, and her hopes for a male heir were repeatedly and cruelly dashed, Margarita Teresa retreated deeper and deeper into the fortress of her devout Catholic faith. In an age where science had no answers for the silent cruelties of genetics, she searched for a supernatural explanation for her unending suffering. She became utterly convinced that her miscarriages and the death of her infant sons were not a result of her own fragile health or a cursed bloodline. She believed it was a sign of divine punishment. She believed that God was angry with her, with Leopold, and with the city of Vienna. In her desperation, her fervent piety found a target. She began to focus on Vienna's Jewish community, seeing their presence as the source of her misfortune. This was not an idea that originated with her. Anti-Semitism was a deeply entrenched and frequently weaponized political force in 17th century Europe. But her personal tragedy gave this ugly sentiment a new, powerful impetus at the very heart of the imperial court. She became a zealous voice, fervently urging her husband, Leopold, to purify the city, to drive the Jews out of Vienna so that God might finally look upon their family with favor and grant them a high son. Leopold, who was himself deeply religious and likely desperate for any solution to his succession crisis, was influenced by his wife's zealous pressure and the anti-Semitic factions at court. In 1670, in a brutal act of state-sanctioned persecution, he ordered the expulsion of most Jewish residents from Vienna. Their synagogue was torn down, and their community was shattered. Margarita had hoped this act of religious purification would finally lift the curse she felt hung so heavily over her family. It was a dark and desperate gamble, born of a piety that had curdled into fanaticism under the relentless, unbearable pressure of her tragic circumstances. But the purification brought no divine favor. Her suffering did not end. The tragedies continued unabated. Her body grew weaker, her spirit more desperate. The girl who had been raised to be an empress, to be a mother of kings, was now a ghost haunting the grand halls of the Habsburg palace, a woman consumed by grief and a grim, unwavering faith that offered no comfort. By early 1673, Margarita Teresa was pregnant again. She was only 21 years old, But her body was that of a much older woman, worn down to nothing by the ceaseless demands placed upon it. In March, while for months pregnant, she fell gravely ill with bronchitis. Already weakened by years of childbearing, she had no reserves left. She couldn't fight it. On March 12, 1673, Margarita Teresa of Spain, Holy Roman Empress, Queen of the Romans, Hungary, and Bohemia, died. She was just 21 years old. An autopsy later revealed the final, crushing tragedy. The child she had been carrying was a boy. The male heir she had so desperately, so destructively sought had died with her. Her husband, Leopold, was reportedly heartbroken, writing that she was his only Margarita. But the dynastic machine could not afford to pause for grief. The need for a male heir was as urgent as ever. Just a few months later, Leopold remarried. Margarita Teresa was buried in the imperial crypt in Vienna, a world away from her Spanish home. Her short, tragic life was over. She had been sacrificed for a dynastic dream, used as a political pawn, and her body had been broken by the biological curse of her own lineage. She had done everything that was asked of her, endured every hardship, and fulfilled her duty to the very point of death, but in the end, her sacrifice had been utterly and completely in vain. The story of Margarita Teresa is one of the most heartbreaking we've ever told here at Chronicles of Old Tales. If you believe her story is an important one that needs to be remembered, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps us continue to bring these forgotten histories into the light. The death of Margarita Teresa wasn't the end of the Habsburg tragedy. It was a dark, chilling foreshadowing of the final collapse. The genetic poison that had claimed her life would soon consume the entire Spanish branch of the dynasty, culminating in a figure so profoundly afflicted that he became a symbol of royal decay for all of history. This was her younger brother, Charles II of Spain. Born in 1661, he was the final, pitiful product of generations of concentrated inbreeding. From the moment he drew breath, he was profoundly unwell. He suffered from a grotesque version of the Habsburg jaw, so severe that his 2 rows of teeth could not meet, making it nearly impossible for him to chew his food properly. His tongue was reportedly so large that he had difficulty speaking clearly and drooled constantly. He was plagued by seizures, endless digestive issues, and was so intellectually disabled that he remained functionally illiterate for his entire life. So startling were his deformities and ailments that many people, including those at court, widely believe he was cursed or possessed by demons, earning him the nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched. His many problems were not the work of witchcraft. They were the predictable, horrific outcome of a family tree that had finally collapsed in on itself. Charles II was the living, breathing embodiment of the dynasty's ultimate failure. He was weak, he was sickly, and, most disastrously for a king, he was impotent. Despite two politically motivated marriages, he was completely incapable of producing an heir. The entire purpose of the Habsburg centuries-long incestuous marriage strategy to secure the line of succession at all costs had resulted in a final king who could not continue it. The very policy designed to ensure their survival had guaranteed their extinction. The fate of Margarita Teresa's own line was no less tragic and futile. Her only surviving child, Maria Antonia, inherited her mother's claim to the Spanish throne. She was married off to the Elector of Bavaria, but her life, too, was short and marked by loss. Her only son, Joseph Ferdinand, was for a time named as the official heir to the Spanish throne, a last, desperate hope to peacefully resolve the impending crisis. But he died suddenly in 1699, at the age of just 6. With his death, Margarita Teresa's lineage was extinguished, her sacrifice, her suffering, her tormented pregnancies, all of it had ultimately led to nothing. When Charles II finally died in 1700 at the age of just 38, The Spanish Habsburg dynasty, one of the most powerful the world had ever known, died within. His death without an heir immediately plunged Europe into chaos, triggering the devastating War of the Spanish Succession. The great powers of the continent, led by the Bourbon dynasty of France and the Austrian Habsburgs, went to war to claim the spoils of the vast Spanish Empire. The conflict raged for over a decade, killing hundreds of thousands, redrawing the map of Europe, and marking the definitive end of Spanish hegemony. The very outcome the Habsburgs had spent centuries trying to prevent through their insular marriages had come to pass precisely because of them. Their house had rotted from within, and now the world was fighting over the pieces. The story of Margarita Teresa and the fall of the Habsburgs is a haunting, powerful reminder of how the obsessive pursuit of power can lead to absolute self-destruct. It's a hidden history, a dark fairy tale buried beneath thick layers of royal pomp and masterful portraiture. If you found this story as compelling and tragic as we did here at Chronicles of Old Tales, please make sure you are subscribed to the channel and have hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten corners of history. And now we want to hear from you. Let us know in the comments, what other historical figures do you know of whose fates were sealed by the ambitions of their family? Let us return one last time to the painting. Look again at the 5-year-old Infanta Margarita Teresa, standing in that impossible light. Velázquez, in his unparalleled genius, created an image of immense complexity, a puzzle box of reality and illusion that has fascinated and haunted viewers for centuries. He painted a moment of seeming domestic peace, capturing the supposed future of a great empire in the innocent face of a child. But now we see the illusion for what it is. We see the horrifying truth that haunts the canvas. We see a girl who was never allowed to be just a girl, whose entire existence was defined by her blood and her womb. We see a political asset, a dynastic pawn whose marriage was nothing more than a strategic maneuver in a continental power struggle. We see a victim of a centuries-long obsession with blood purity that was, in truth, a slow-acting poison. We know that the beautiful, serene child at the center of this masterpiece would become a chronically ill woman, broken by an endless cycle of pregnancies and losses, dead at 21. We know that the powerful dynasty she was meant to save would crumble into dust within a single generation. Its final era grotesque parody of a king, its collapse igniting a world war. Las Meninas is not a portrait of hope. It is an epitaph. It is a memorial to a girl whose life was stolen from her before it had ever truly begun. The tragic life of Margarita Teresa is a chilling testament to the devastating human cost of royal ambition, a story that reminds us that behind the gilded facade of history, behind the crowns and the castles and the priceless masterpieces of art, there are real human beings. And sometimes, their stories are not fairy tales, but nightmares.